I'd like to invite Rufus Logan, Head of the International Services for the BR Group, onto the stage, please. Thank you, Rufus. Alexei Muratov, Partner in Stroka KB. Thank you, Alexei. Welcome. Hello, hi. So, Sergei Kuzmin, Head of the Scientific Support and Global Operations Office in Rospotrebnadzor. Welcome. Welcome. Let's see. And last but not least, Roman Sichov, Vice President of Ingrad. Roman, thank you. We're going to listen to presentations. Each of them, the questions, will be limited very strictly to 8 minutes. And unfortunately, we'll have to cut you off if you go over 8 minutes. So very, very strict timing. For those here in the hall, I'd like to also draw to your attention that during the session, you'll be invited to participate in a short survey, for which you'll need the official Moscow Urban Forum application on your mobile phone. You can download it in the App Store and Google Play app stores. So, I would like to, our first panelist this morning is Anne-Marie Aguirre, Director of Operations, International Well Building Institute in Europe. Anne-Marie, WELL is the leading global body for standards and instruments to create healthier and more productive buildings. Would your organization be ready to share its knowledge and instruments as a key element of Moscow's strategy for healthier buildings? And what role has WELL played around the world in this respect? Press the button.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Guy, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this incredibly innovative conference. The International Well Building Institute is really excited to share the research and the medical guidance and the architectural guidance that we have to help develop healthy buildings and communities. What really shapes our efforts is that we really believe that buildings and communities are health intervention tools, and that if we allow ourselves to design buildings with better ventilation, better natural daylight, that we can actually have an impact on the long-term health of our inhabitants. So our mission is to work hand in hand with governments, developers, architects, engineers, human resources professionals, and policy directors to be able to share these resources and build them into the new design guidelines for both cities, buildings, and public realm. WELL is the premier global standard for health and well-being. We are, to date, have 413 million square feet of property around the world, and that's in 55 different countries. We are very proud to know that 25 of those countries are in Europe, and we see this program escalating every year that we develop. WELL cuts across operational silos, so we're starting to bring together the medical profession, the architectural profession, and also understand human resources and finance. How do we start to understand the return on investment we can get from buildings that operate in a healthy standard? We spend 90% of our time indoors. Our bodies were not designed to spend this much time indoors. But science and technology has enabled us to control things like infectious disease, being ever more comfortable with conveniences, entertainment, and telecommunications in our lives. Yet our modern living environment has created new health risks, like we spoke about earlier today. Sedentary lifestyles, the lack of physical exercise, obesity, diabetes. The boundaries for work and life and travel are blurring. We see the emergence of agile working, co-working, flexible hours. Work can be done from anywhere at any time. But what's the cost of this to our mental stress? Poor nutrition, as we've heard this morning, is a major contributor to a risk factor for preventable chronic disease, such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes. In 2014, WELL was launched as the first building standard to actually focus 100% on the health and well-being of building occupants. In 2017, we launched the WELL Community Standard, Again, expanding the work beyond the single building into the community and public realm, looking at the entire neighborhood and community in the process of health. The vision for a well community is inclusive, integrated, resilient, with a strong community identity. So both of these standards marry the best practice in design and construction with evidence-based medical research. That's the difference. Harnessing buildings and communities as vehicles that should be able to support optimum health. These 10 concepts encompass vital areas for intervention across the urban landscape. They include design strategies that require specific zoning, construction, or geography. Policies that apply to ongoing practices, rules, or schedules, alongside performance-based metrics for environmental thresholds. So let's talk about the first category. Poor ambient air quality is the #1 cause for premature mortality. We should be able to breathe easy with optimum air quality supported by source elimination, building ventilation, and passive design. Our air concept features address ambient air quality, reduce traffic pollution, and reduce human exposure. As of 2015, 663 million individuals still lack access to clean, safe drinking water. Our water concept addresses drinking water quality, public water sanitation, and the promotion and access to drinking water globally. Oh, sugar. Sorry, this is moving a little bit quicker than I thought. Worldwide obesity has doubled since 1980. Well communities encourage better eating habits and food culture by requiring the availability of fruits and vegetables, limiting processed foods, and limiting artificial ingredients. We understand that overstimulation and habit disruption is caused by nighttime lighting in excess, and it has been shown to have adverse effects on the human condition. This light concept addresses poor and proper illuminance levels for roads and walkways and limits light pollution. They need a new clicker. Okay. According to the World Health Organization, common barriers to physical activity often include the fear of crime and violence in outdoor spaces, poor air quality, and the lack of infrastructure. Our fitness concept looks at promoting active lifestyles through cyclist infrastructure, walkability, and active transport. Really important concept here is about mind. So well communities help support cognitive and emotional health through mental health policies, stress management programs, and restorative design. The state of chronic stress leads to depression, cardiovascular disease. Restorative blue spaces and green spaces need to be designed into master plans. We've often talked about health and heat in Europe this past month. So urban heat island effects are a major problem in developed areas. The effects can cause increases in energy consumption, elevated emissions of air pollutants, decreased water quality, and compromised human health. This concept encourages design codes for extreme weather events and policies. Exposure to environmental noise is correlated to adverse health outcomes, leading to sleep disturbance, cognitive impairment, and stress. The sound feature here incorporates noise pollution assessments, hearing health education, and acoustic stress management. Common outdoor structures today often are hazardous foundations of biocides and fungicides. Even pesticides and herbicides today are commonly used in landscaping that pose serious health risks. Our material concept is pushing the supply chain to be more transparent in the contaminants that we are experiencing. And our last and final concept is the well community concept, which really cultivates equitable, integrated, health-promoting environments through wellness programs, policies, and community engagement. The community concept stresses the importance of civic engagement, public art, social spaces, and community health resilience. In 5 years, we have quickly grown to reach 3,400 projects in 55 countries, including the first well-registered project here in Moscow that we are really excited about. Almost half of these projects exist in Europe, with 25 countries putting forward their projects for WELL certification. So our current lifestyle favors driving over biking, sitting over walking, and riding in elevators over taking the stairs, texting over face-to-face conversation, and screen time over outdoor recreation. Collectively, we must shift our thinking so that buildings and infrastructure are as important as immunizations, parks, paths, and plants are as beneficial as prescription medicine, and friends and neighbors are more important than sitting in front of TV. So thank you very much.
Anne-Marie, thank you very much. Some very good points there which lead on from the plenary session this morning, lots of the practical solutions. So now I'd like to ask a question to Rufus Logan. So Rufus, the BRE is one of the leading global research and standards bodies for construction worldwide. You created the BREEAM standard, which is now used in millions of buildings and has been adapted into many languages and territories, including Russia, where our council and the MGSU have carried out several initiatives, including localized training of students in 6 universities across Russia. BREEAM looks at health and well-being as one of the 10 areas of a building or community. To what extent can BREEAM act as part of a strategy for a healthy Russia, a healthy Russian built environment? And is this a priority area for the BRE?
Thank you very much. Yes, can everyone hear me okay? Hi, good afternoon, I think it is. It's Rufus Logan. I'm from the Building Research Establishment based in the UK. I work in Scotland and run from the office in north of London. I'm actually delighted to be here and listen to the morning's plenary session, which touched on a lot of things I'm going to run through. I've got a number of slides, but I'm just going to tell a bit of a story about what BRE is, what we do in this, and focus really on the healthy standards based around construction and the built environment. But we are an international multidisciplinary building science organisation with a mission to improve buildings and infrastructure through our research and knowledge generation and their application in the real world. So research and development of standards is critical to what we do. We actually have been running since 1921, when we were founded by the UK government to build homes for heroes coming back from the First Great War, and we were privatised in 1997. We have a number of offices around the world, and our standards and services are actually operational in over 80 countries around the world. But our expertise, especially in research, follows into those categories there around BIM, building information management, energy, fire, innovation and resilience, safety and security, and of course sustainability. One of the things that the research does, the BRE, we're wholly owned by a trust, the charity called the BRE Trust. So when we were founded, we created a charity. I work for the operating business. But that charity undertakes research to look at ways of building better, more productively, have a better place to live and work. And one of the projects that I want to highlight is there was a Future Cities project that ran between 2012 and 2015 that actually we levered in £30 million worth of work, worked with 70 partners across 14 cities and with 16 universities in Europe and actually a couple of universities in South America and Brazil. But what we do with that as a company is we hopefully translate that into work that other people can take forward. So it's not just for us, it's for the betterment of the built environment, but also it develops how we progress as a business. So that grid there at the bottom right, we're now looking very closely at livable cities, resilient cities, smart cities, and of course healthy cities. So what the research does, it feeds into our products and services to ensure that they're up to date, they have rigor, and they can be applied to the modern condition around the world. And these are some of our brands. Guy mentioned BREEAM, SQL underneath is for infrastructure, SABRE is security and safety. LPCB is actually the oldest, and that's the Loss Prevention Certification Board, which is fire safety and fire resistance in products and building design. And we have an academy, innovation park, and so on. So what is BREEAM? BREEAM is a sustainable standard, internationally recognized measure of building sustainability, and it helps to drive sustainable performance and value. We actually have we have about 2.2 million buildings around the world registered under the BREEAM scheme, and about 800,000 have been certified by BRE Global, our certification body. The key thing about BREEAM, why it was established, and it was established actually, I think about 28 years ago, which is quite incredible to think. We've been developing the standard for 28, coming on to 30 years now, is to assess, reward, and crucially motivate environmental, social, and economic sustainability in the built environment, and to empower those, like all of us here in the room, that work in the built environment to make that change happen. But then to give it independent certification, and that gives confidence to the users of those assets as well as the developers. So we do want to recognise higher performance. And we do that in covering 9 categories now. And each of those categories we assess we put goals and targets against that can be adapted to countries where they're operational, and the weightings might adapt as well. So, for example, about 5 years ago, we began developing the BREEAM standard for China, taking part with the Chinese government on their 3-star standard, their Green Star standard for buildings, and they were very keen to get us involved in their development. We have an international standard, as Guy mentioned, with assessor network that help companies deliver that, and this is what we're looking to develop here. I think the way it works is it always goes beyond regulatory minimum for that country, and we then reward as you move towards an aspirational in terms of environmental performance, and that's similar for the infrastructure projects. BREEAM Communities is one of the BREEAM families, so we cover for new building, for BREEAM in use, which is particularly developing fast. It recognises improvements to existing buildings because the building stock exists. But the BREEAM in communities is a way of dealing with city scale or large development scale to look at the master planning and how can you add sustainability metrics and for what is it you want from it. So it's quite a flexible measure, and we can develop that on individual project basis. But it has we have a framework there that's around those categories, and it looks at and makes decisions, or it helps planners and master planners and the development team, make the right decisions around sustainable outcomes they're trying to achieve from it. Because obviously the graph that demonstrates there, once you go into final design and then construction, there's much less you can do to the outcome that you're trying to achieve. So setting those outcomes early in a project scale is really important. And then I just wanted some of the value case studies for sustainable buildings generally, and the BREEAM standard as we've discovered over the last 30 years of working in this space. You know, developers typically do invest 2% more when targeting a higher BREEAM rating, but they actually recover that. We've discovered in research that they recover that investment within 2 to 5 years through both savings on the energy and water bills, but actually, and they actually achieving lower rating of BREEAM costs little or no additional cost. Just make sure I'm on time. I'm going to pick out a few of the key things here. Some of the value and driving performance that BREEAM standard can help clients and asset owners do. I mean, we have delivered 22% reduction in CO2 emissions against like buildings. So doing research into the buildings that have been BREEAM assessed. The World Green Building Standard states that green certificate building sales price do increase for up to 30%, and rents can be higher. And about 28% of that is allocated to the BREEAM, the certification itself. One of the things I've worked on myself is the poor quality homes. We did some research looking in the UK, and actually that figure there, the NHS, which is the National Health Service of the United Kingdom, you know, poor quality, so the worst quality homes, so not all homes, just the ones that are categorised as the worst quality homes, cost our health service £1.4 billion per year and £18.6 billion to societal benefits. So actually getting things right at the beginning or adapting buildings to perform as you want them to for health is absolutely critical. But how do you translate that cost savings into the built environment is the thing. And of course, as was mentioned previously, staff costs. We spend a lot of time indoors. We spend a lot of time at our office desks or traveling. 90% of operational costs are due to staff costs. So actually, good air quality will increase productivity. It's shown to do that. Correct lighting, access to open space. There's evidence out there. So we in BRIAM want to credit that and give rewards for people that achieve that. And then just finally, a few pictures of where it's been applied around the world in different aspects. So Redvedco, one of the largest real estate management companies in the world, greening our portfolio over the next 2 years is not only environmentally the right thing to do, it also makes sound business sense. Aviva investors, all new acquisitions must have a BREEAM rating. This is an office block that went through a BREEAM rating, and basically there's no doubt that productivity, employee well-being have been increased according to that large tenant and employer of the people in the building. And in Stockholm, where we've seen BREEAM in Sweden and Scandinavia pick up considerably, both at city scale and buildings, we regard that certification system is an excellent tool in the ongoing work to constantly improve our buildings and management of those buildings. That's from the City of Stockholm. So thank you very much. I look forward to engaging with you in a discussion about how we can go forward from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rupert. Thank you for everybody for keeping the timing as well. So we've heard from our foreign guests, our international guests. I'd like now to give the floor to Alexei Muratov, who's a partner in Stroka KB. Mr. Muratov, you've created the Consolidated Standard for the Improvement of Moscow's Streets, a document recommending planning solutions for bringing higher levels of comfort to the urban environment. In this document, did you take into account all these green aspects, the sustainability aspects, when preparing that standard?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Guy, for this your question about the standard of improving Moscow streets. The standard which we developed in 2015-2016. But if I may, I'd like to expand a little bit the question which you have asked and to go beyond the framework of our discussion, because following the standard for the Moscow streets, we also developed the standards for all the open spaces in Moscow. And recently, we almost finished the work with the Ministry of Construction in Moscow on the comprehensive development of the city. This is a consolidated set of documents as to how to develop residential areas in Moscow. So there are some people present here who are involved in that work, for instance, Andrey in the first row. When we did that, and the scope was quite huge, we came to a conclusion that certainly healthy or non-healthy city depends at the level of the city planning. And these would be the planning solutions and the architectural decisions which would determine whether the city is going to be healthy or not. If we look at the evolution of the city building or urbanistic philosophy, we'll see that the concept, the idea of a healthy city actually goes back to the middle of the 19th century. And the advanced and modernism architecture also conveys this idea of fighting against tuberculosis and other infectious diseases. And Anne Bronovitskaya, a famous historian, said that advanced guard actually was born and derived from the fight against tuberculosis. Step by step, the healthy city concept was put forward, and the main idea was to leave the old city or the downtown and reside somewhere in the outskirts where the situation is greener. And another idea was proposed to build the so-called sleeping residential quarters to separate people from anything harmful or hazardous. Those two concepts, the garden city and a kind of a modernist city, actually married in the Soviet concept of a micro-district, which on the one hand was quite green, densely populated, and at the same time could boast a lot of high-rises. And we know that 90% of the city of Moscow, these are the micro-districts, so to say. But step by step, we saw the evolution of the urbanistic thoughts, and we see that this agenda has changed dramatically. And instead of individualizing everything and separating everything, we see the concept that cities should be very diverse, similar to the environmental or natural systems, which are also diverse, I mean biodiversity. And this is one of the foundations of the healthiness or well-being. And it means that people have to live side by side, closer to one to one. This is what is being written in the Triumph of a City book. And on the other hand, the buildings have to be as close to one another as possible, so that there are a lot of conveniences, convenience shops and convenience everything, that we could see some pedestrian flows which would rehabilitate the city, whereas more people walk, and we see the reduction in the CO2 emissions from the cars and vehicles. At the same time, we see that a concise and compact size city is more environmentally friendly. It is not so detrimental to the environment. And for instance, the London School of Economics says that in London the ownership costs are 40% less than everywhere else. And for instance, in London, the households they consume less water, less energy than, for instance, the ones in France. When we developed our standard, we wanted to look at how such a city could be built following our Russian effective regulation. And it turned out that it is not a piece of cake, because actually our regulations actually were designed following the Soviet concepts of micro-districts and remained unchanged since 1950s, 1960s. Certain amendments and changes occurred to more splittering or fracturing, meaning that a lot of different norms and bylaws were introduced. Sometimes they were totally unnecessary. The concept to individualize and separate everything, schools, buildings, shops, streets, for instance, we know that the city plan of Russia, for instance, implies that the width of a city should be 100 meters and the parking lots should be 25 meters away from the residential house. Schools have to be away from the red lines of the streets about 25 meters. If we take all these figures all together, if we take all those regulations together, we'll see that such a compact size and diverse city is almost wishful thinking. And we started a big work with the Center for the Regulation Designing and with the Russian FDA ministry as to somehow make the city compact size but at the same time quite diverse. When we finalized our list, it contained about 300 different draft laws. The Ministry of Construction launched these our amendments, proposed those our amendments for the discussion, but then it occurred to us that probably the whole system is quite wrong, and probably it would make sense to simplify the whole system, to identify some minimum standards, making just one separate book to follow. And as for the rest, following the example of our British colleagues, we could use that as a guideline. And certainly the guidelines should be simple, clear, and unambiguous. I do think that this reform is very much overdue, and introduction of serious green standards could be of some help. really, green standards would also make us change the whole regulations. So probably we have to rebuild the whole system. Excellent.
Thank you. Round of applause. So, Sergei Kuzmin, you're the head of the Scientific Support and Global Operations Office in Rospotrebnadzor. Your office is responsible for ensuring that citizens and visitors from Moscow can enjoy a safe environment. Is Moscow currently a safe place in terms of air quality? And would you be prepared to work together with the Moscow departments, the other departments here, to create a green building strategy to ensure a healthy environment for Moscow City?
Good afternoon. I would like to start with a message, with a statement which was also mentioned during the plenary session in the morning. If an average European spends 90% of his time behind the closed doors, this is according to the European Commission, according to the American Institute, an average American spends about 87% of his time in the closed dwellings. Our Russian citizens spend more than 80%. This is actually the bulk of the life which was spent in different rooms, in different buildings. And certainly the requirements which are set, which do exist everywhere in the world, they are aimed at safe accommodation in those rooms and dwellings. Certainly, megacities develop at a skyrocket pace, and certainly not only the conditions in those cities change, but also some needs and requirements of the residents will change. There is more demand for higher rates and higher levels of safety and security. People want to live in safer and healthier cities. These tendencies become quite obvious, especially when we look at the evolution which takes place in the international certification systems. Originally, these systems, they actually focused on the energy efficiency of the buildings, environmental protection criteria, but now the focus has shifted as to how the labor conditions affect people, how actually spending some time in the room would affect mental health of a person and his overall well-being. If we look at the national standards which are effective in Russia and the standards proposed by the international certification systems, probably the comparison is not very appropriate for three reasons. First of all, our national Russian standards, especially the ones which are pertinent to the hygiene and to the construction, they mainly are about safety and security. The certification systems, they cover a broader range of questions which are quite supplementary to the standards which are being used in Russia. Secondly, the certification systems is based on certain points, which is not the case for Russia. And the standards and norms, which are effective in Russia and abroad, sometimes are very much different. As an example, for instance, the noise pollution in the residential houses. You know, the WHO believes that in the daytime it should be 35 decibels, and this fully meets the standards which are applicable in Russia. And at night, WHO recommends that this rate is reduced to 30 decibels. Whereas in Russia, this indicator, and this is scientifically justified, not only from the standpoint of safety, but in terms of the comfort of sleep, bearing in mind the most vulnerable groups of people, such as the elderly, for instance, so we reduce this rate to 25 decibels. And there are multiple cases, there are multiple examples which show that the world is ready to embrace other factors to assess the health of the cities. and we see the global tendency to make the requirements more rigid. Russia is no exception from that. We are revising norms and regulations due to obtaining new scientific data from Russia and from abroad. And at the moment, we are trying to streamline and harmonize our Russian standards and the international ones to bring some conformity, especially bearing in mind some mandatory standards which really would provide necessary well-being. Some recommendations are optional, supplementary, which may be of some help in order to meet the mandatory requirements. This process is quite sophisticated and it needs better funding. And business community probably would be very much interested in that. But I'd like to stress another topic. The existing standards of construction and hygiene standards now provide for the safety of the city. They are mandatory now. And in fact, they are all pinpointed by the standards and requirements which are used by the international certification systems. That's for sure. Secondly, I'd like to remind all of you, a question was asked about comprehensive zoning and planning, but let's not forget about such a delicate topic as comprehensive greening, planting of green trees everywhere. Certainly, this is very important to build healthy environment for the people to live. One example derives from from the Netherlands, in the city of Amsterdam, where the green zones amount to 20% of the total area of the city. So a survey was made, and it clearly showed that the green zones increase by 10% would be comparable to 5 years rejuvenation. Most importantly, the WHO recommendations also state that at least 10% of the total urban area should be green, and at least 50 square meters per person. This is the figure applicable to the greening. So in Moscow, we have more than 100 square meters of green trees per person in Moscow. And the standards which were followed when designing Moscow, when developing the residential quarters, proved to be quite efficient. And it is not by accident that when implementing convenient city and comfortable city concept, 80% of the residents appreciated the development and improvement of the city, including building green parks. And Muscovites spent twice as much time in parks as the average Europeans do. During the plenary session, we spoke about the following: that the city development of the urban environment, comprehensive development, and the requirements which are put forward in terms of safety are clearly important, not only to improve the safety but also to improve the living standards and the quality of living. What we may say in terms of the toolkits available there, certainly there are voluntarily certification systems which may be helpful to develop city agglomerations. First and foremost, for us, it is clearly very important to clearly define the terms, give the definitions of what comfort means. Comfort, houses, quality of living. So these are very subjective terms, and therefore we have to do some public opinion polls, some sociological research, in order to find out how the residents themselves assess the quality of their living, the quality and the rate of comfort. Different estimates and different assessments could be proposed for different cities, but this is something we have to bear in mind when designing the cities. Secondly, it's already been said, and all the certification systems are embracing the project-based approach. And for instance, a building has been designed, has been built, and now we get down to operation. Let me draw another example in terms of the noise pollution. So in Moscow, we have more than 2,000 claims daily related to the noise sources which are located somewhere within the building. Usually, these would be some technological noises, some pieces of equipment which emanate this noise. And we see that actually the number of these sources of noise rose 2 times.
So we should also evaluate appropriate buildings. And what I have already mentioned at the beginning, this is quite important. We need the system of certification, which should provide not only for safety, but also should give some additional criteria and options which define now the level of life, quality of life. We welcome this because realization of this idea, innovations, technical solutions allow us to create necessary conditions and also provide for the appropriate health level and shift to a different level of lifestyle. And this is also our national strategy. Thank you very much.
Some very good points there, which reinforce what we heard before about people spending more time outside, doing active things in the parks in Moscow. So we've heard from standards bodies, we've heard from urbanization bureaus. Let's now talk to industry. So if we pass the microphone over to Roman Suchov, Vice President of Ingrad. Mr. Suchov, Ingrad is one of the largest real estate developers in Moscow. And to what extent are your clients interested in health when they purchase an apartment? And what is Ingrad providing to them to fulfill these needs? Do you use green building standards in your developments, for example, like BREEAM and WELL?
Good afternoon. I will be the voice from the fields, so to say. First of all, we understand, so the whole industry is only at the beginning of our way. So this notion, even green construction, I don't know how, even we don't have this, we did not coin even the term for this. Even now we don't have the term for this in Russian language. But Ingrad company is... So our customers are in the center. And when a person comes to our office to buy an apartment, he is interested usually in 3 key things, which we could include in the understanding of green construction. First, safety. So I don't speak about location, price now. So safety first. Then a healthy lifestyle. Then I will speak later what I mean. And also potentially he's interested in ecology issues, generally speaking, like emissions of CO2, heat emission of this building to the atmosphere, to the air, the level of energy saving. Among these 3 items, the first, safety, as I mentioned, nobody asked about it. And why? Because our government, regarding regulations, and norms of construction regulates us quite strictly and effectively. That's why people are calm. They understand that if they buy an apartment, a building, it's already safe if there are permissions for the construction to the developer are given, for example. So people are confident in this. And then second, healthy lifestyle. Maybe you all see this, that in our society there is a real need for this healthy lifestyle, but everybody understand it quickly. Some don't drink alcohol, others are jogging in parks, others have healthy food, but still we have this a general direction now. And buyers also are interested here in location. They are interested in parks, green territories, also proximity to some transport junctions, for example. And sometimes this can be a plus or minus for buyers, these transport junctions. Also, they're interested in different workouts, yards, and proximity to infrastructure, sports, usually of sports facilities. A healthy lifestyle, what is it for our buyer? For our buyers, these are these three things, but practically nobody asks about safe construction materials, whether construction materials are safe or not, because again the government controls these construction materials very well in our country, and that's why developers themselves also control this very strictly. And the third part, which concerns voluntary certification, nobody practically asks about this voluntary certification. This is just from our experience. Now, regarding the standards which exist now, responsible and big developers also who have some social function when they have this complex developing of the territory. So they have their also the internal standards. These internal standards are also stringent, and they meet the current needs of our customers and buyers. But these internal standards cannot be done from outside, because I think they go from the ideology which is inside of the company. For example, our company, as any commercial organization, wants to maximize profit, of course, but also not at any price, And these internal standards which exist now in our company, I won't name them, but I will name three principles of our internal ideology of our company. So for the first principle, customers' product, comfortable product are the heart of our company. So three principles. First, we will never will develop product on the site if we don't understand how we can create good quality and safe residential area. We'll refuse from the bat, from maybe a suspicious or doubtful project, even if we can get profit from this, because we have quite tough principles about the product, the end result. Secondly, we will never construct some additional square meters, even if again is beneficial for us, but we can compromise the quality with this additional square meters. We'll never do this. We'll never have this additional meters in this case. And we never save if suddenly we need some additional measures at the venue which we develop. For example, creation. So here, I mean also this healthy, comfortable, safe product. This is regulated from inside of the company, and this external demand usually the people don't ask about this, but we have our internal principles. Also, so 15 or 20 years ago, developer, if he wanted to construct and sell its product, he had norms, restrictive norms, which existed, in the law. But later, developers started to pay attention more to customers, to buyers, and they decided to improve product and the result. Now, practically all developers speak only about the product. For us, product is very important, and we want to create the product which could satisfy healthy needs of our customers. It could be safe and everything good for a customer. And before this, developers were quite reactive. They responded to the needs of the community, of the society. But now, developers are at the same level of the government, practically, of the organizations which offer certification, including environmental, and they become more proactive. So they offer something to the community, something new. They show what else can be brought to community, and already it comes from us. So developers have ideas how to improve the situation here. Maybe even they give additional education and training in this direction, like this.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we have a few more minutes, and what I'd like to ask each of the panelists is a question for each of you, is what steps could we do after we've heard everything this afternoon? What steps could we now take, practical steps in the next year, let's say, or what priorities should there be to move to a healthier and better Moscow? We've heard about the challenges. We understand the challenges, but what should be the priorities and what are the low-hanging fruits? Maybe we can start with Roman. I mean, you mentioned lots of positive things that your company is doing, your corporate standards. Maybe there's something in the marketing, for example, that you could do, or maybe some other aspects.
Well, so the first one, what I would like to mention about, so I would like to speak about Moscow, and I agree with this statement that Moscow, became more beautiful recently. And so, Guy, yesterday we went together with you, and I shared my impressions about Moscow with you. And I said yesterday that I live in Moscow, and several years ago I was thinking to go somewhere with my family on vacation, somewhere out of Moscow and out of Moscow region. But during last 2-3 years, I understand very well if I want to rest, I don't have to go out from Moscow and Moscow region, because with my family now I spend time in Moscow or in the parks of Moscow or regional parks. And so Moscow agglomeration, I think, goes in the right direction here. What can we do further? At the global level, I have already mentioned this. This is the joint work of developers, the state bodies, and then afterwards. And the practical step, we need to develop industrial zones. Alexei, what? Guy, thank you very much. This is quite a wide topic, and we could see that there are so many things which can be accumulated here. But let's start with some kind of strategy, or we should define some main priorities of healthy city. When we discussed our neighborhood, so we wanted to say this, that maybe we have to develop the standards of quality of life of Muscovites. And then we should have this standard, and on the basis of this, we could have some other standards. We need this document. And then there are some other things and in each metropolis we have to improve it. Also, we should get close to the indicators of healthy city. And Moscow is dragging behind the infrastructure of active mobility. And if we compare Moscow with European cities, it's not adjusted for bicycles and some other light traffic, but these flows increase. In our standard of streets in Moscow, we wanted to make all streets much greener, and we have to continue this topic because Moscow streets are not green enough. And the colleagues already mentioned that trees have very good effect for health. And also, we have to increase a number of housing square meters because the project of renovation in Moscow, again, is not, compared with the standards. For example, UN Habitat developed a lot of standards, and here maybe for us, sometimes we copy the Soviet time buildings with high-rise buildings with not many square yards for streets, and it's an obstacle, I think, for Moscow, and we have to improve this area.
Anne-Marie, you've been here in Moscow. You've got a fresh view. You've just been here for one day. What are your views? What's immediately apparent?
I think the transition that has taken place since the last time I was here, which was 10 years ago, is pretty dramatic, and it's very positive, and it feels like there's a fabulous energy going forward. I think the direction that I would leave or hope that comes out of this sort of incredible forum where you've got so much talent coming together is to sort of really collaborate and be open to sharing policy and research from professions that are not always at the table in design and construction, like the medical profession, like scientific profession. I think the two main qualities that I hope every city really addresses is healthy air quality and healthy water quality. That's sort of the two of the fundamental basics of healthy living. But I think if you really want to push the boundary and look for innovative solutions, I think food is a really key component, and trying to offer a varied selection of healthy food and allowing local sourcing of food products to come into the city, possibly even growing your own food inside your city, is a real key component. The other two areas that I think I'm seeing with potential growth and attraction in the UK at the moment is around censored environments. So really looking at measuring air quality indoors, so looking at CO2 levels and volatile organic compounds, so the really nasty compounds that are coming off of things like furniture and paints and sealants, really trying to get to the heart of what the supply chain is delivering into our homes and our offices and our schools for the folks that live here. And then the last element that I'd love to pick up on is wellness should not just be for the wealthy. I think we have to really start to understand that healthy is an equitable goal for all, and that even though we're seeing corporations and folks that really can afford to provide healthy workplaces for their staff, we need to think about healthy environments for every strata of society.
Thank you very much. And we're running out of time, just maybe 1 minute each. Rufus, and then Sergei, what are your points? Priorities?
Yeah, I think the priorities seem to be about right. There's a strong leadership from what I can see in Moscow, and that's something that when I've been looking at cities around the world, people say in research as well, leadership is actually critical to it because you want to be pushing the boundaries, as has been said. I think also as BRE, we like to look at outcome orientation. So what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve in terms of citizens' health, people who live and work in cities, and how can you describe that in a simple way? And actually, the work we looked into, a Healthy Cities Index, an international one, it shows how complex it actually is. So there is a piece of work there, I think, for the Moscow and maybe the other Russian cities, in particular other Russian cities, where can you take all that learning and knowledge from organizations around the world and build it into some outcome-orientated indices that the leaders of the city can put forward, and then companies can come through and use standards or certification measures or whatever they are that apply those outcomes to it.
Wonderful, thank you. And Sergey, last but not least.
Поскольку времени уже нет,
So just one thing, we will cooperate, and here there are people who are on one page, and we understand our goals very, very well. We have the Department of Moscow and business community, also our scientific organizations, and I think we will pool our efforts and go together.
So, colleagues, we'd like to invite you to join our discussion and using the application, take part in a short survey. To do this, you need to go to the official Moscow Urban Forum application. I hope that you've all downloaded that on your phones, and find the name of the session in the Urban Health Hall, Healthy Space, How to Implement Healthy Standards into Construction, and then click on the survey button. Has anybody found that one? Hopefully with the technology we can actually use that. So I believe now on the screen we're going to see the questions. Right, here are the questions. So I'll also read them out, so in case you can't see them, but I think you can see them also on your so, how should the city stimulate the implementation of design and construction standards that are focused on the health and well-being of people? The first question is, well, the first option is information campaigns. Second one is tax arrangements, so deductions and subsidies and stimulants for the standards. Third one is tightening of the general regulations and new regulation. The fourth one is investment in technology and innovation in the construction industry. Fifth is stimulating, is possible, the city should independently build the most significant objects around these standards. And the last one is the city should not encourage the introduction of standards in this area. So while our colleagues are voting, we invite each of you to speak briefly on this issue. Maybe you have some extra points to add from those points. We have a couple more minutes, literally. Anybody have anything to add of those 5 or 6 options? Anne-Marie? Yeah.
Thank you, Guy. I guess I would just say that really, in order to get dramatic change, I think we need to have legislation sort of demand things like minimum air pollution requirements, also to really demand ventilation rates inside buildings, and really to look at sort of the choices that people have, whether it comes to food or exercise, really allowing that to be sort of a legislation requirement.
Okay. Sergey, you do work a lot with the regulation. Do you think we need more regulations, tighter regulations, stricter regulations, or less regulations even?
нет, вопрос.
I do think that this is rather a question whether the effective legislation or the effective requirements are enough and sufficient in order to provide necessary rate of safety. But as you understand, we are discussing the questions of health, and health depends not only on safety, but it depends on the accessibility of certain social and other types of infrastructure and services. These are the conditions which would help people live healthy, have some recreative options, follow a healthy lifestyle. So it means that these are standards which are not defined by the regulations, but rather which are defined by the demand from the people. People demand certain level of convenience, of comfort. And the business community has to live up to those expectations. And the competitive advantages which are there, this is something which would meet this demand.
What do you think? Is it more carrot or stick as a developer? Do we need more rules or do we need more incentives?
No more regulations. На самом деле, я считаю.
I do think that out of what's been listed there, the tax mechanisms would be a better incentive, but the tax benefits should be granted not just to the developers, but probably to the SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, which would provide certain solutions, green solutions to the developers. So I would opt for the tax benefits for the small and medium-sized enterprises. And investments into the technologies and innovations, I do think that this is what I would opt for too. You know, actually I can opt for everything and vote for all the 6 points. I'm not very clear about item 3 and just tougher or more stringent regulations and norms. I would speak about balancing, more balance to the regulations, because there are some under-regulated spheres and there are over-regulated spheres. When we spoke about the internal code of honor for the developers, that's great, but it means that the city building industry is not very well regulated, is under-regulated, because once you have necessary regulations or guidelines and architectural codes, you won't need any ethics codes. Everything would be there in those regulations and norms. I do think that we'd rather balance the regulation. We have to add more balance.
We see the numbers are changing as people speak. They're sort of lobbying for various points.
No, I think I've agreed with most of what the panel has recommended here today.
That's cool. Rufus, any last words?
Just, I think an observation about the investment in technology and information in the construction industry. I sort of agree with that, but it's interesting how that will impact in the health arena. I think we're doing a project, for example, called BAM, which is Buildings as a Materials Bank, whereby it's a European project whereby we're looking at recycling not just buildings, but the materials within the building, the sort of fittings and fixtures and so on as well. And whether that leads to more healthy lifestyles, I'm not sure, but it's certainly it lowers the environmental impact when you're retrofitting or looking at buildings. This is commercial buildings in particular.
Thank you very much. Well, as we can see from the hall, investment in new technologies seems to be the leader, and then in some sort of tax breaks. We've had long discussions with developers of all types, also working commercial property and other types of property, and they've always reinforced this idea that they need some sort of stimulus from the city. If they're going to build green, healthier buildings, they need to work together with the city in a way to get some sort of benefits that way. Thank you very much to all the panelists for coming. One last word. Go on.
May I ask you, yesterday you told me about a very interesting example, a very interesting case of how the city may bring more incentives for the green standards. Can you draw that example? There are lots of such examples.
Okay, developers, how are they convinced to build more? So, for example, every developer wants to build on a certain site more meters, more square meters, because he'll obviously increase his revenue. I know that several examples in the UK where if you're going to get planning permission for just a regular building, you would get so many meters you could build, let's say 50,000 meters. If you agree to build to BREEAM Excellent, then they allow you to build an extra 20,000 meters, because they say it will be well, the infrastructure required will be a lot less. So that's a good example, and that's actually many other stimulants which aren't being used at the moment in Moscow. Personally, I would like to see a complex strategy using a lot of the different elements we've heard today, working together. I know the departments in Moscow at the moment work pretty much separately in this. One of the departments on the environment has their own views, and the construction in another, and energy in a different one. We should come together. So thank you very much, all the panelists, for a wonderful discussion. Thank everybody for coming, and hope to see you again next year. Bye now.